Have you ever swam in a river? How about tubing? Well, if you've ever swam or tubed in a river, you understand there's a couple qualities about a river that you just can't get away from. The first quality being that the river is always there. That it doesn't matter if you're in the mountains or say you're in Central Park, you never question whether or not the Rappahannock is still there. You know it's there, even if you can't see it. You know, another thing about the river is that to truly experience the river, you must get in the water. You know, you could sit on the banks and you can know the chemical properties and you can know what it's made of and if it's muddy or clear. But there's some things that you will never know unless you get in. For instance, you can't know the temperature of the water, if it's hot or if it's cold, unless you get in it. You don't know the taste of it if you don't get in it. You know, you don't know the feeling of that water rushing against your skin unless you get in it. But most importantly, you can't be involved in the river unless you get in it. You know, the last quality of a river that we're going to discuss today is that there is a life in the river. There is so much life underneath the surface of the water that we hardly ever see, and especially if we don't get in the water. But you know, in early days, the river was the source of all life. All the civilizations, the big civilizations, were raised up around rivers because it fed the plants and the animals. And that is still true today, that the rivers are the source of life a lot of times. You know, I have this picture in my head of how silly it would be if someone was to go to a mud puddle and start just splashing around and celebrating in a mud puddle. And how silly we would look around and they'd say, man, I found everything I need because it's water. And instead, knowing that if they just kept going a little bit longer, they would realize that they really tapped into the real source of life. Not the counterfeit, not even just the beginnings of the water, but instead that there's so much life waiting for them once they get to the full river. So I have a couple scriptures to share with you, and especially as we talk about with Crossroads Vineyard and what this means. Of course, we are talking about the river in the context of corporately experiencing God. And so much of experiencing God in a corporate setting is about our worship and about experiencing what God is already doing. So I wanted to share a couple verses with you, and the first one being John 5:17. And I'm reading out of the New Living Translation. And Jesus replied, "My Father is always working, and so am I." Simple as that. And what Jesus is saying there, first of all, is that the Father is always working. And it's just as we discussed with the river, that the river is always there. And it's such the same way, the Father is always working. And how true is it sometimes that we don't even think that God's working on our behalf because we don't see Him moving, but instead to know that He is always working. Same way as the river, always flowing, always being there. You know, the second half of this verse, Jesus simply says, "And so am I." So am I. You know, and just like we discussed that, you know, you can know about your Father working, but until you get into the river, until you get into what the Father is doing, you have no idea what you're really doing. And so Jesus said, hey, my Father's always working and so am I. Because he is flowing, I do too. And just as we discussed, the river is that you don't know the river unless you get in the water. And how are you to really know what the Father is doing unless you jump in and do it with him? The last verse that I wanted to share with you is out of Revelation 22, verses 1 and 2. And it says, then the angel showed me a river with the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing from the throne of God. It flowed down the center of the main street. On each side of the river grew a tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit, with a fresh crop each month. And the leaves were used for medicine to heal the nations. And as we discussed that the river is the source of life, and it is the case also that we can worship all we want, and it can sound good, and it can be considered the coolest worship ever. But unless we are tapping into the source of life, the river of God, we are not touching the heart of the Father, because the heart of the Father moves in the river. So as this scripture in Revelation explains, whether it's literal or figurative, there is a big meaning out of this. And that out of the throne of God flows a river. And we have a choice. We can either jump in and tap into that, or we could sit on the sidelines and critique it and criticize it, and we could talk about it. But God is looking for people, and I believe for Crossroads Vineyard, we are called to jump in the middle of the river and start to fish. And of course, fish from Him. That is what God is doing. That is the river. He wants our worship to be a river of life, and that trees and crops flow out of it and rise up around it. The fruit rises up around it. Why? Because the river of God is a river of life. That's my desire at Crossroads Vineyard. So as we discuss a river today, I hope you enjoy some of the discussion that you're going to have, because your small group leaders have spent a lot of time creating some great questions for you to discuss. So have fun with this, and I hope you enjoy trying to build that parallel between our walk and our worship to God and the river of life that's coming from the throne room of God. Have fun. We love you guys. See you soon.